They mocked me when I planted the red flags, said I was paranoid, said I was ruining the view. But I wasn't trying to make a statement, I was trying to save their lives. Because the ground beneath this perfect suburban dream, it remembers. And it doesn't forgive ignorance. They ripped out my warnings, built a park over a collapsed zone, held a party, right where the earth was ready to give way. And when the rain came, the land swallowed everything, their clubhouse, their money, their pride. I didn't need to say I told you so. The ground did it for me. This isn't just a story about a neighborhood disaster. It's about how truth gets buried until the earth decides to dig it back up. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, they'll wish they'd listened. I still remember the first time I drove up that winding gravel road 20 years ago, right after my last tour ended. The air felt thinner up there, cleaner, as if the world had decided to leave this corner untouched. Wild grasses bowed in waves under a breeze that carried no echo of gunfire or distant explosions, just the quiet rustle of leaves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. The town below was small, the kind of place big city folks drove past without ever noticing, and that suited me fine. After a career spent in chaos, I craved permanence, wide open space, unbroken silence, and ground that wouldn't shift beneath me unless I understood exactly why. The parcel I bought sat perched on the upper edge of a long, gentle slope that dropped sharply into the valley. From the road, it didn't look like much scattered boulders, stubborn clumps of sagebrush, and one ancient oak whose trunk twisted toward the sky, as if it had spent centuries leaning away from something unseen. But I saw potential. More than that, I saw safety, if I respected what lay beneath the surface. Before the Army, I'd studied geology. After the Army, I never stopped. I'd watched entire forward operating bases disappear under avalanches in Afghanistan, seen mountainsides peel away in slow, inevitable sheets, while men screamed over failing radios. I knew how quickly stable ground could betray you when water weight and time conspired. So the day after closing, I hired a licensed surveyor, not for boundary disputes, but for the truth. The report came back exactly as I'd feared and expected. A historic landslide scar ran diagonally beneath the lower third of my lot, a remnant of the 1961 slide that had swallowed 2 homes whole in a single night. The soil layers told the story clearly, a thick wedge of loose, water-sensitive clay resting on fractured shale, waiting for the right season of rain to turn treacherous. I didn't panic. I simply acted. Within a week, I was out there with a post-hole digger driving sturdy cedar stakes along the precise contour line the engineer had marked. I painted each one a bright, unmistakable red. From every post, I hung small plastic warning flags that snapped sharply in the wind. And on the stakes facing the downhill side, I bolted aluminum signs I'd had custom made. Unstable slope, historic landslide, zone. No structures or heavy loading beyond this line. I wasn't planning to build anywhere near that boundary. My small cabin would sit well upslope, anchored into bedrock. But I knew that one day, someone else might look at this hillside and see only a view worth millions. Those red posts weren't for me, they were for whoever came after. For 15 years, no one challenged them. My lot remained the quiet outlier on the edge of a modest cul-de-sac governed by a sleepy little HOA, whose biggest concerns were unapproved holiday decorations and the proper shade of beige for mailbox posts. They sent me the occasional newsletter about lawn height restrictions, but otherwise left me alone. I returned the favor. We existed in a chilly but functional truce. Then the merger happened. The original HOA dissolved into a larger regional association with deeper pockets and grander ambitions. Overnight, our Forgotten Ridge became Phase 2 of the prestigious East Ridge Estates master-planned community. Surveyors in neon vests appeared. Heavy equipment rumbled up the road before dawn. Where once there had been empty lots and deer trails, oversized homes began rising 3 stories tall, fake stone facades, columns that served no structural purpose except to announce arrival. A clubhouse went up at the center of it all, complete with a pool, tennis courts, and manicured walking paths lit by ornamental lanterns that glowed like fireflies every evening. I watched from my porch as the transformation unfolded, a growing knot in my stomach. The new paths, the grading, the added weight of concrete, and imported topsoil, All of it crept closer to the line I had drawn in red so many years before. I should have known the storm was coming the morning the silver Lexus pulled into my driveway. A woman stepped out mid-40s, petite, immaculate auburn hair, wearing a tailored red blazer with a gold HOA pin gleaming on the lapel. She carried a clipboard like it was both shield and weapon. Her smile was practiced, efficient, and never reached her eyes. "Mr. James Rourke," she asked before I could speak. "That's me. I'm Linda Talcott, president of the East Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." She extended a manicured hand. I shook it briefly. "We've received several complaints about the red stakes and flags visible from the new community trail. Residents find them unsettling." "They're there for a reason," I said evenly. She tilted her head, waiting. "That slope has a documented history of catastrophic failure. The stakes mark the upper boundary of the 1961 landslide zone. I have the geotechnical report if you'd like to see it." Her smile thinned. "Mr. Rourke, this is a residential neighborhood, not a construction site. We're building a sense of community here, beauty, harmony, shared pride. Visual clutter like that undermines the aesthetic we're working so hard to achieve." "They're safety markers," I replied, "not clutter." She glanced past me toward the ridge, as if the hillside itself might apologize and remove the offense. When it didn't, she tapped her pen against the clipboard. "I'm afraid the board has deemed them unauthorized structures on Association View property. You'll need to remove them within 30 days, or we'll have to assess fines." I met her gaze without blinking. "Those markers stay." The smile vanished entirely. "Then we'll have to address this through official channels." She turned on her heels, clicking sharply against the gravel as she returned to her car. The Lexus backed out smoothly and disappeared down the hill. That night, I walked the boundary line one more time. The wind had picked up, rattling the plastic flags like warning bells. I tightened the wire on the farthest stake, ran my fingers over the faded but still legible lettering on the sign. For years, I'd half considered taking them down myself out of weariness, out of the loneliness of being the only one who seemed to care. But I left them standing, because the ground beneath us doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about property values or neighborhood aesthetics or whose turn it is to host the holiday party. It only remembers what it's capable of. And it had already shown me long ago exactly what that was. The first real clash came on a crisp autumn morning when the leaves had just begun to bleed red and gold along the ridge. I was splitting firewood on the side of the cabin when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. The same silver Lexus glided to a stop, and Linda Talcott emerged this time in a camel coat over her signature red blazer, clipboard still clutched like a talisman. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Rourke, the board has reviewed your refusal to remove the markers. We're moving forward with formal enforcement." She handed me a thick envelope sealed with the HOA's embossed logo. "You have 14 days to comply before daily fines begin." I took the envelope but didn't open it. "You're fining me for warning people about a documented hazard." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "We're fining you for installing unauthorized structures and creating visual blight on community view property. The aesthetic guidelines are clear." I finally tore the envelope open. Inside was a stack of color photographs, close-ups of my red stakes taken from the new walking trail, each one circled in red marker like crime scene evidence. Attached was a petition signed by 17 residents, most of them new arrivals, complaining that the flags made evening strolls anxious and unwelcoming. I looked up at her. "Did any of these people read the signs, or did they just see red and assume danger?" "They see what affects their home values," she replied coolly. "And right now they see an eyesore." I folded the papers and slipped them into my back pocket. "Tell them the real threat to their home values is building on unstable ground." She gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Our landscape architects have reviewed the site. They assure us the soil is perfectly stable for passive recreational use." "Landscape architects," I repeated, "not geotechnical engineers." Linda's eyes narrowed. "We have experts, Mr. Rourke. You're just one man with old reports and a grudge against progress." I stepped close enough to see the faint tension in her jaw. That old report was signed by a licensed professional engineer. It's not an opinion. It's data. For a moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the oak branches overhead. Then she turned away. 14 days, she said over her shoulder heels, clicking back to her car. That night, I emailed the entire board every address listed on the new HOA website. I attached the original geotechnical survey, the 1961 landslide, news clippings, and a scanned copy of the city's archived hazard map. I kept the message short. This is not a negotiation. This is a warning. Please review the attached documents before proceeding with any grading or construction below the marked contour. I hit send and waited. The reply came 2 days later, a single line from the association's attorney. Cease all unauthorized communications with the board. Further correspondence will be considered harassment. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the old familiar burn of frustration I'd carried home from war zones, except this time the enemy wore pressed wool and carried a legal letterhead. A week later, the grading began. I woke to the growl of diesel engines echoing up the slope. From my porch, I watched a small fleet of machines, bobcats, a backhoe, a roller carve a wide curving path just below my property line. They were building the scenic overlook loop, part of the new community greenbelt. Sod trucks followed, unloading rolls of bright green turf that looked almost plastic under the morning sun. The path cut within 15 feet of my red stakes. In some places, the grading scraped so close that one of the flags now hung over freshly exposed clay, the color of dried blood. I walked down to the site that afternoon. A crew in neon vests was staking out locations for benches and decorative boulders. I found the foreman, a weathered man named Miguel, with a clipboard of his own, and showed him my survey map. "You're working inside the historic failure zone," I said, pointing to the contour line. "That clay layer liquefies when saturated." He studied the map, brow furrowing. "Ma'am from the HOA said the ground was tested, said it was good. Your ma'am hired landscapers, not soil engineers." Miguel glanced toward the ridge, then back at me. He lowered his voice. "Look, I just run the equipment. But I got kids. If you say it's bad, it's bad." He nodded slowly, then waved over one of his crew and quietly moved the next bench stake 10 feet uphill. Small victories. But Linda noticed. The next morning, another certified letter arrived, a $500 fine for interfering with approved contractors. Attached were time-stamped photos of me speaking to Miguel. I paid none of it. Instead, I drove to City Hall and met with Brian Park in the engineering department break room, 2 veterans nursing bad coffee and worse memories. I slid the new HOA letters across the table. They're grading right up to the scarp. Brian flipped through the documents, jaw tightening. "They can't do that without permits. They're calling it landscaping maintenance. No permits required." He exhaled through his teeth. "Classic loophole. Can you flag it?" "I can open an inquiry," he said, "but it'll take time. And you know how these boards lawyer up." I nodded. Time was the one thing the slope didn't have much of. That evening, I stood at the boundary again. The new path gleamed below me, smooth and inviting, curving gently toward a freshly poured concrete pad, where a bench would soon be bolted down directly over the softest spot on the entire hillside. The flags still fluttered, but now they looked small against the scale of what was coming. I tightened the wire on the nearest stake, feeling the rough grain of cedar under my palm. For the first time in years, the old anger, the kind I'd learned to bury under discipline and distance, stirred in my chest. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about what happens when people choose the illusion of safety over the reality of risk. And I knew, standing there in the gathering dusk, that the ridge and I were about to be drawn into a fight neither of us had asked for. The fines kept coming first, $500, then $1,000, then daily increments that stacked up like cordwood. I framed the notices on my workshop wall, not out of pride, but as reminders of how far people would go to avoid an inconvenient truth. Each envelope arrived with fresh color photos, my red flags fluttering against a backdrop of new sod circled in aggressive red ink as if they were graffiti instead of lifelines. I appealed every citation. I attached the original geotechnical report, the city's archived hazard map, even a letter from the engineering firm that had done the survey 20 years earlier, reaffirming that the risk remained unchanged. The HOA's response was always the same, a form letter signed by Linda Talcott, rejecting the appeal for failure to comply with community aesthetic standards. Meanwhile, the ridge kept changing. Every morning I walked the boundary with a notebook and a measuring tape. I logged tiny shifts, a half-inch drop in the path's edge, a new hairline crack threading through the fresh concrete pad where the first bench would sit. I photographed everything timestamped and GPS tagged, building a quiet archive of evidence. The clay was already breathing, softening under the weight of imported soil and the slow creep of irrigation runoff from the new mansions above. I tried the diplomatic route one last time. The HOA scheduled an open forum in the half-finished clubhouse, all exposed beams and the smell of fresh paint. Folding chairs were arranged in perfect rows beneath temporary chandeliers. Residents trickled in wearing Patagonia vests and carrying reusable coffee tumblers, chatting about school fundraisers and the new wine club. I sat in the back row wearing the same faded field jacket I'd worn in Kosovo, feeling like a relic among polished stone. When the public comment period came, Linda recognized me with a tight smile. "Mr. Rourke has the floor. 5 minutes." I walked to the microphone carrying a small projector. I'd prepared slides, simple, stark images. The 1961 landslide scar, the current overlay of new construction cross-sections of the clay layer, photographs of the subtle slumps already forming along the path. I spoke calmly, the way I used to brief commanders before missions no one wanted. "This isn't speculation," I concluded. "It's physics. Add enough weight, saturate the clay, and the slope will fail. Not might will. The only question is when and how many people will be standing on it when it happens." Silence for a beat. Then a man in the third row, new build 3-car garage, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, sir, we paid a premium for this view. We didn't pay for fear." Laughter rippled through the room, nervous at first, then bolder. Linda leaned forward. "Thank you, Mr. Rourke. The board has consulted licensed professionals who assure us the area is safe for light recreational use. We're moving forward with the park as planned." I gathered my projector and walked out, while someone in the back muttered "conspiracy theorist" loud enough for the microphone to catch it. That night, I reinforced every stake. I drove them deeper, replaced frayed flags with new ones that snapped louder in the wind. I added reflective tape so they'd glow under headlights impossible to miss. Impossible to claim ignorance. 2 days later, the crew returned. I heard the backhoe before I saw it, a low mechanical growl, rolling up the slope like distant artillery. From my porch, I watched the operator swing the bucket in a lazy arc and clip the corner post clean off. The red stake toppled, flag fluttering once before it hit the dirt. The operator never even paused. He just kept grading, smoothing the earth as if erasing a mistake. Behind him came volunteers in matching neon safety vests, handing out bottled water and glossy flyers. "Welcome to your future Serenity Park. Grand opening this spring." Linda stood at the center of it all, red blazer bright against the raw dirt, directing traffic with small, imperious gestures. When her gaze drifted uphill and met mine, she didn't look away. She lifted her chin just slightly and offered the smallest, coldest smile. That smile said everything. This is war now. And she believed she'd already won. I went inside, pulled the full binder of documentation from my file cabinet, the original stamped report correspondence photographs, and walked it down the hill. The crew parted as I approached Linda. I opened the binder to the critical page, the soil borings, the shear strength graphs, the bold red warning box that read, "High liquefaction potential." I held it out to her. "This is an opinion," I said quietly, loudly enough for the nearest volunteers to hear. "This is engineering fact. You keep loading this slope and it will move. People could die." She glanced at the page as if it were written in a foreign language, then pushed it back toward me. "We have our own consultants, Mr. Rourke. Professionals who work with developments like this every day." "Your consultants get paid to make problems disappear," I replied. "The earth doesn't take bribes." A flush crept up her neck, but her voice stayed level. "This is no longer your land. Stay out of our way." She turned her back on me and waved the backhoe forward. I stood there a moment longer, watching the machine chew another foot closer to the line I'd drawn so many years ago. The smell of fresh diesel and torn clay hung heavy in the air. Then I walked home, pulled out my phone, and called Brian Park again. "It's escalating," I told him. "They're actively erasing the warnings." On the other end of the line, Brian was quiet for a long second. "Send me everything you've got, new photos, the fines, the timestamps. I'll push it up the chain." "How far up?" "As far as it needs to go." I hung up and looked out the window. The sun was setting behind the ridge, painting the exposed clay the color of old blood. Somewhere down there, a machine was still growling, smoothing the ground that had already begun to shift beneath it. I knew then that diplomacy was over. The next move wouldn't be words. It would be consequences. The escalation didn't creep in, it charged. First came the new Visual Uniformity Ordinance, rushed through in a midweek board meeting with barely a quorum. The language was bureaucratic velvet, oversteel all signage stakes, flags, or markers visible from community trails or common areas must now receive prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. Anything unapproved would be removed at the owner's expense, plus fines. My red warnings instantly became violations. A certified letter arrived the next morning, 7 days to remove every stake and flag, or crews would do it for me and bill me triple. I read it twice, then folded it into the growing stack on my desk. I appealed again this time, with a twist. I included Brian Park's preliminary inquiry from the City Engineering Department, a one-page memo noting potential geologic concern requiring further review. It wasn't an order, but it carried official letterhead. I hand-delivered copies to every board member's mailbox and posted a scanned version on the community forum with a neutral title, City Engineering Memo regarding ridge stability. The forum exploded. New residents flooded the thread with outrage, not at the risk, but at me. This is fear-mongering. Property values are already soft. Why can't we have nice things without someone ruining it? One woman posted a close-up of my flags with the caption, "Drama in red," but a handful of private messages trickled in too. Older residents, people who had lived here before the big builds. One man wrote, "I've noticed my basement door sticking since they graded the path. Thought I was imagining it." Another, "My wife saw water pooling behind our fence after light rain. Never happened before. Seeds." Linda countered the next day with a glossy PDF from a private landscape architecture firm. It was full of reassuring charts and photos of happy families on similar recreational slopes. The conclusion: soil conditions stable for intended low-impact use. No mention of liquefaction potential, no shear strength tests, no reference to the 1961 event. Just pretty renderings of the finished park. I read it once, then forwarded it to Brian with a single line, paid optimism. His reply came fast. "We're sending a field team next week." But the HOA moved faster. I woke at dawn to the metallic clank of crowbars and the low murmur of voices. From my bedroom window, I saw them, 4 volunteers in orange safety vests, working their way along the ridge like a cleanup crew after a storm. One by one, they pried my cedar stakes from the ground, clipped the wires, gathered the signs into a neat pile. The flags, bright red against the pale morning sky, were folded and stuffed into a black trash bag. I dressed quickly and stepped outside. The youngest volunteer, a college kid with uneasy eyes, hesitated over the last sign. "Subsidence, risk, do not disturb." He looked up the slope, saw me coming, and froze. "Morning," I said, voice calm but carrying downhill. "You're destroying documented safety markers on known unstable ground." The woman beside him, an enthusiastic newer resident I recognized from the forum, shrugged. "We're authorized." Linda said, "Everything's been cleared by experts." "Which experts?" I asked. She gestured vaguely toward the clubhouse. "The ones the HOA hired." I pointed to the sign still in the kid's hand. That warning was placed in response to a licensed geotechnical engineer's report. Removing it could be considered tampering with hazard notification. The kid shifted his weight. "Look, man, we're just volunteering." That's when Linda arrived. Her Lexus crunched to a stop on the new gravel path. She stepped out in pressed khakis, and inevitably, the red blazer sunglasses perched in her hair despite the overcast sky. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Mr. Rourke," she said, walking toward us with measured steps. "This is association maintenance on association land." The board voted unanimously. Your installations were never permitted. I held up my phone, already recording. The City Engineering Department has an open inquiry. You're removing evidence of a flagged hazard. "It's not binding," she replied smoothly. "It's precautionary. And these stakes are eyesores. People's lives are more important than your view corridor." Her smile was thin, triumphant. "Stay off the work site, Mr. Rourke. We wouldn't want you to get hurt." She turned to the volunteers. "Finish up. Mulch delivery arrives at 10. They hesitated only a second before resuming. The last stake came free with a dull pop of roots. The kid avoided my eyes as he dropped it onto the pile. By noon, the ridge was bare. Fresh sod had already been laid over the contour line, erasing any trace of where safety ended and danger began. Two heavy steel benches were bolted into concrete footings poured directly on the softest clay. A tasteful brass plaque on one read, "Donated in loving memory by the Talcott family." I stood at the edge of the new park, hands in my pockets, feeling the ground beneath my boots slightly spongy, breathing moisture from the previous night's dew. The forecast called for steady rain starting tomorrow. Linda surveyed her kingdom from the path, arms folded, satisfied. I took one last photograph, the empty slope, the benches, the plaque gleaming in weak sunlight. Then I went home and emailed Brian the new images with a subject line, in all caps, "They just erased the line." His reply came within minutes. Field inspection moved up to tomorrow morning. Do not engage further. Let the city handle it. I stared at the screen, then out the window, at the innocent-looking green swath where my warnings used to stand. The ridge was now a blank canvas, and they were about to paint their future on it. I only hoped the city arrived before the ground decided to write its own ending. The city team arrived the morning after the markers vanished, 3 white trucks, with municipal seals pulling quietly onto the new gravel lot beside the clubhouse. Brian Park stepped out first, clipboard in hand, followed by 2 geologists in sturdy boots and a senior inspector carrying a laser level. They moved with the deliberate calm of people who had seen disasters before they happened. I met them at the Ridge, coffee thermos in hand. Brian nodded toward the freshly sodded park. They didn't waste time. No, I said. They wanted the evidence gone before any one official looked. The geologists wasted no time either. They paced the slope, driving thin probes into the ground at measured intervals, reading moisture and resistance on handheld devices. One of them knelt beside the new concrete bench, running a finger along a hairline crack that had appeared overnight. "Shear strength is already dropping," he muttered to Brian. "Saturation's higher than it should be this soon after grading." Brian glanced at me. "You were right, it's active." Before they could finish, Linda appeared. She strode down the path, flanked by 2 board members, all 3 clutching their own clipboards like shields. Her face was flushed beneath carefully applied makeup. "This is private community property," she began, voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You need board approval for any inspection." Brian held up his badge. "We're here under municipal authority, pursuant to a citizen hazard report and preliminary findings. Section 4C of the Geologic Oversight Act gives us access to assess risk on any communal or public use land." Linda's eyes flicked to me. "Let me guess, your source is the resident who's been harassing us for months." I didn't rise to it. "The source is the ground itself, ma'am. It's moving." One of the geologists looked up from his probe. "Confirmed subsurface fissures. Moisture content critical. We're recommending immediate closure." Linda's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, her composure cracked just a flicker, but I saw it. "We have our own reports," she started. "From landscape designers," Brian cut in gently. "Not licensed geotechnical engineers. There's a difference." The inspector took photographs of the bench crack, the soft spots where footprints sank too deep, the subtle bulge forming downhill from the concrete footings. Within an hour, yellow caution tape ringed the entire park. Hand-lettered signs went up, "Unsafe area, no entry." Brian filed the temporary closure order on his tablet and emailed it to the HOA's official address. Linda stood at the tape line, arms crossed tight, watching her vision cordoned off like a crime scene. That night, the board held an emergency closed session. I wasn't invited, but by morning, every mailbox on the ridge held a slick letter on HOA letterhead. It announced a temporary park closure due to unforeseen heavy dew and minor settling after recent rains. No mention of the city order. No mention of risk. Just a promise that everything would reopen as soon as conditions improve. The letter was dated 2 days earlier, before the inspection. They were already rewriting history. But the neighborhood noticed. Private messages multiplied. People who had once dismissed me now asked quiet questions. A retired nurse 2 houses down confessed her basement had developed a new crack shaped like a lightning bolt. The stonemason across the street stopped me during my morning walk. "Ground feels wrong under the new path. Too soft, like walking on a waterbed." They were waking up, and the sky was darkening. 3 days later, the rains arrived, not in gentle showers, but in relentless sheets that turned the air metallic and cold. Gutters overflowed within hours. Water raced down driveways, in braided streams pooling exactly where I knew it would, along the upper edge of the old failure zone, seeping into the disturbed clay like blood into a wound. By the second day, sections of fresh sod peeled away in ragged strips exposing raw earth the color of wet cement. A retaining wall below one of the new mansions bowed outward with a groan I could hear from my porch. The HOA newsletter that week still gushed about the successful park installation and included a ribbon-cutting photo of Linda smiling beside the now taped-off bench. I saved the image. Evidence. On the third night, lightning splintered the sky and the wind howled down the valley like something furious finally unleashed. I couldn't sleep. I paced in boots and rain jacket flashlight in hand, listening to the old oak creak and the constant roar of water. At 2:17 a.m. I felt it. A low visceral shudder, not the house shaking, but the ground itself exhaling. A soft lurch under my feet, then another, like a giant turning over in restless sleep. I stepped outside into the downpour. Rain lashed sideways, stinging my face. I aimed my headlamp down the slope. The concrete bench had split clean in two. One half tilted drunkenly, the brass plaque glinting before it vanished into a widening fissure. Dark water swirled where solid ground had been moments before. The slope was moving, not in a sudden cataclysm yet, but in slow, deliberate stages. The topsoil sloughed first, then the saturated clay beneath began to flow. The park lights flickered as underground cables shifted. And incredibly defiantly, the HOA's Spring Unity gathering was still scheduled for the following evening. They'd moved the event only 20 yards uphill, still inside the yellow tape zone, but far enough for plausible deniability. Tents were already going up when I walked past at dawn, white canopies folding tables, a rented bounce house, anchored with stakes driven deep into the softening earth. I found Linda directing setup beside the grill station raincoat, over her red blazer hair, plastered but chin high. "You have to cancel this," I said, rain drumming on both our hoods. She didn't look at me. "The forecast says clearing by afternoon. The ground is fine. The city closed this area for a reason. There are active fissures. You're putting children on liquefying clay." Her eyes flashed. "Your obsession doesn't get to ruin everyone else's fun, Mr. Rourke. This isn't about fun. It's about survival." She turned away, waving over a volunteer with sandbags for the tent legs. "We've taken precautions." I stood there a moment longer, water streaming off my jacket, watching families arrive early to help kids, darting between tents, laughter cutting through the rain. Then I went home. I pulled my emergency radio first aid kit, harness, and ropes from the closet. I texted Brian 2 words, "It's time." And I waited in the dark, listening to the storm rage, and the earth beneath us begin its ancient, unforgiving answer. The rain didn't let up. It hammered the ridge like artillery, turning the air thick and metallic, drumming on rooftops and gutters until the whole neighborhood seemed to vibrate with it. By nightfall, the new park's lights glowed weakly through the downpour, casting watery halos over the white tents where music played and laughter rose in defiant bursts. I stood just beyond the light's edge, raincoat hood pulled low, watching families cluster under canopies, kids chasing each other between tables, adults balancing paper plates and plastic cups of wine. The bounce house swayed gently in the wind, its bright colors muted by the storm. Stakes held it down, driven deep into ground that had already begun to soften. At 9:12 p.m., the air changed. The wind died suddenly. The rain eased to a steady hiss. An unnatural stillness settled, the kind that makes your skin prickle, the silence before a flashbang before incoming rounds. Then came the sound, a deep muffled crack like old timber splitting far underground. The ground trembled once, a subtle roll under my boots. Then again, harder. Screams erupted inside the tent. I ran toward the light. The bounce house was sliding. Not tipping, sliding sideways, as if the earth beneath it had turned to grease. Children tumbled out the open flap, some laughing at first, thinking it a game, until parents' shouts turned sharp with terror. The entire near side of the park dropped 4 feet in a heartbeat. Tents lurched, poles snapped like matchsticks, tables overturned, sending food and drinks cascading into sudden rivers of mud. People scrambled in every direction, slipping, falling, clutching children. Flashlights and phone screens bobbed wildly through the chaos. A woman's voice rose above the rest, calling a name over and over. And then the main failure began. It wasn't a single dramatic roar. It was layered, almost patient. First, the topsoil peeled away in great sheets curling like carpet. Then the saturated clay liquefied and flowed, carrying everything downhill in a slow, viscous wave. The concrete bench, the one with Linda's family plaque, split with a gunshot crack and vanished into the widening sinkhole. The brass plaque spun once in the swirling water before disappearing. The clubhouse, built partly on the lower slope, groaned like a wounded animal. Its foundation cracked audibly. Windows shattered outward in glittering sprays. The entire west wing tilted, walls buckling inward, roof beams sagging before the whole structure slid forward in agonizing slow motion. Bricks and timber tumbled into the basin, raising dull thuds that echoed up the hill. I keyed my emergency radio as I ran. East Ridge Estates, active slope failure in progress. Multiple structures involved, civilians in danger. Need fire, EMS, and search and rescue immediately. I reached the edge of the collapse just as a boy, no more than 8, sank to his waist in what had been the mulch bed. His eyes were huge arms flailing for something solid. "Hold still," I shouted over the rain. I dropped to my belly, spreading my weight, and crawled forward until I could hook my climbing harness to a nearby tent stake that hadn't yet pulled free. I extended my arm. "Grab my hand now." His fingers slipped twice in the mud, then locked around my wrist. I braced my boots against a half-buried boulder and hauled backward with everything I had. He came free with a wet sucking sound, and I rolled us both uphill just as the ground behind us crumbled away in a fresh slump. We lay there gasping, his small body shaking against mine. I wrapped my jacket around him. "You're okay, buddy. You're okay." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. I looked back toward the clubhouse. What remained of it clung to the slope like a broken toy, lights flickering inside shattered rooms. Filing cabinets and furniture spilled out the open side, sliding into the muddy lake forming below. The smell of wet earth and torn insulation hung thick in the air. Neighbors stood at the safe perimeter, some sobbing quietly, others staring in stunned silence. A few called out names into the dark. Phone lights swept the wreckage like searchlights. Then I saw Linda. She stood ankle-deep in mud near the yellow tape foil blanket draped over her shoulders by an EMT red blazer, darkened to the color of dried blood. Her hair hung in wet strands. Mascara tracked down her cheeks. She looked small, almost childlike, staring at the place where her vision had been. Our eyes met across the chaos. Her lips moved. I couldn't hear the words over the rain and sirens, but I read them clearly. I didn't know. I didn't answer. Because she had known. Every report, every photograph, every plea, I had placed them in her hands. The city had confirmed it. The ground itself had whispered warnings for months. She simply hadn't listened. Now the earth had spoken in a voice no one could ignore. And it wasn't finished. Fresh cracks spider-webbed outward from the main scar. 2 homes higher up the slope, both recent builds directly over the old fault, began to sag. Porch rails tilted. Garage doors buckled. One house's front foundation dropped suddenly, sending a shower of shingles cascading down the hill. Fire trucks roared in red lights, strobing through the rain. EMTs fanned out with stretchers and thermal blankets. Police established a perimeter, their floodlights turning the scene into a stark, surreal stage. I handed the boy to his frantic mother, then moved along the edge, helping where I could, pulling a teenager from a mud-filled depression, guiding an elderly couple upslope, directing rescuers to voices still calling from the dark. By the time the rain finally thinned to a drizzle, the park was simply gone. A ragged basin of raw earth and standing water remained 30 feet wide, and growing, littered with broken benches, twisted tent frames, and the scattered remnants of a celebration that had ended before it began. The clubhouse was rubble clinging to the hillside. 2 homes were half swallowed, their interiors exposed like dollhouses torn open. And in the sudden quiet that followed the sirens and shouts, the only sound was water dripping from broken eaves and the soft, relentless settling of the slope as it continued to adjust to its new shape. I stood at the edge, soaked to the bone chest, heaving. I had never wanted to be right. Not like this. But the ground had remembered what people forgot. And tonight it had collected its debt. By first light, the ridge looked like a battlefield after the guns had gone silent. Floodlights from the emergency crews still swept the wreckage, turning puddles into mirrors of fractured sky. Drone cameras buzzed overhead, feeding live footage to every regional news station. The basin that had been the park steamed gently in the cold morning air, a raw wound exhaling mist. I hadn't slept. I sat on my porch with a mug of coffee gone cold, watching investigators in white Tyvek suits pick their way across the debris field. They moved carefully, photographing every cracked foundation, Every displaced boulder, every piece of clubhouse roof tile, half buried in mud like fallen scales. Captain Reyes, the incident commander from the night before, found me there around 8. He climbed the steps, slowly, boots caked with clay, and lowered himself into the empty chair beside me. "Quite a night," he said. "Quite a preventable one." He nodded, eyes on the scene below. "Media's already calling it the East Ridge collapse. They've got your name. Retired Army geotech officer who warned the HOA for months. You're about to become famous whether you like it or not." I exhaled slowly. I never wanted fame. Just for someone to listen. Well, they're listening now. He pulled out his phone and showed me a local news clip, already looping drone footage of the sunken clubhouse, the tilted homes, the yellow tape flapping in the wind. The anchor's voice was grave. Questions are mounting about why multiple warnings from a resident expert were ignored. Reyes pocketed the phone. "FEMA's on their way. County prosecutor too. This isn't going to stay local." He was right. By noon, the first FEMA SUVs rolled in quiet gray vehicles with federal plates, no lights, or sirens. Director Hayes stepped out tall and composed, surveying the slope with the practiced eye of someone who had cataloged disasters from hurricanes to wildfires. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and asked if I'd walk the site with her team. We moved along the perimeter while her engineers took soil samples and laser scanned the scar. I pointed out the exact contour where my stakes had stood, the spots where the benches had been bolted, the flow paths the water had followed. "You documented all this beforehand?" she asked. "Every step. Photos, drone footage, emails, certified letters. It's all time-stamped." She nodded once. "Good, we'll need it." That afternoon, the narrative shifted fast. Reporters set up live stands at the community entrance. Residents' faces, pale voices, shaking spoke to cameras about basement cracks they'd ignored, about HOA reassurances, about the night the ground simply opened. One mother held up her son's muddy shoe, the one he'd lost when I pulled him free. "If it wasn't for Mr. Rourke," she said, voice breaking. The HOA tried to control the story. A hastily written press release went out blaming an unprecedented, atmospheric river event and act of God. Linda did not appear on camera. Rumor had it she'd retained counsel and was staying inside. But the internet had the ribbon-cutting photo, the one from the newsletter, Linda smiling beside the bench that now lay 30 feet downhill. Side-by-side screenshots spread like wildfire before and after. Captions read things like, "Pride comes before the fall and built on denial." Within 48 hours, the dam broke. Residents packed an emergency community forum held in the undamaged gymnasium of the nearby elementary school. Folding chairs filled every inch of floor space. People stood along the walls. The remaining board members sat on a raised dais, looking shell-shocked. Linda arrived late, escorted by a lawyer in a dark suit. She wore no blazer today, just a plain gray sweater, hair pulled back severely. She did not speak until directly addressed. I stood near the back, arms folded, watching the room turn on the people who had once fined me for trying to save them. One by one, residents rose. A woman whose home now leaned 5 degrees off plumb demanded to know why safety markers had been removed. The stonemason asked why community funds had paid for concrete footings on known unstable ground. The mother of the boy I'd rescued simply held up his muddy shoe again and said, "My son almost died on ground you called safe." Linda tried to answer something about due diligence and expert consultation, but her voice cracked halfway through. The lawyer beside her leaned in, whispered, and she fell silent. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice. I walked to the microphone carrying a single folder. "I'm not here to say I told you so," I began. "I'm here because 3 separate warnings, 2 from city engineers, 1 from a licensed geotechnical firm, were delivered to this board in writing. Everyone was dismissed." I laid out the documents on the table in front of me, page by page. Fines for safety markers, emails begging them to stop grading, the city's preliminary advisory, the paid landscape report that avoided the word liquefaction entirely. The crowd was silent, absorbing each piece like evidence in a trial. When I finished, no one clapped. They didn't need to. The room had already reached its verdict. By the end of the week, the HOA board was gone. Resignations came in a wave, some quiet, some public and tearful. Linda's was delivered through her attorney. The association itself was placed under temporary city receivership pending financial audit and possible dissolution. Investigators subpoenaed bank records, meeting minutes, email servers. And the first lawsuits landed civil claims from displaced families, citing negligence, fraudulent misrepresentation, and reckless endangerment. The ground had shifted, but this time it was the power structure that crumbled. I watched it all from a distance, helping where I could, coordinating sandbag deliveries, marking new tension cracks for the engineers, answering reporters' questions with the same calm I'd once used to brief officers before dangerous missions. People started calling me Jim again instead of that cranky vet. Some even apologized. I accepted the apologies without triumph, because vindication tasted like ash when homes were cracked open and children woke screaming from nightmares of falling. But beneath the exhaustion, something else stirred a cautious hope that maybe, just maybe this time, the lesson would stick. That the next person who stood alone with an inconvenient truth would not have to wait for the earth to scream before being heard. The neighborhood entered a strange limbo after the collapse, a hushed, wounded quiet that settled over the ridge like fog after battle. The dissolved HOA left a vacuum. No more newsletters dictating shrub height, no fines for unpainted fences, no clipboard patrols. In their place came city trucks, insurance adjusters, and the low hum of generators powering temporary trailers where displaced families sorted through salvaged belongings. People moved differently now. They walked the streets with eyes cast downward, scanning for new cracks in driveways, listening for the subtle creak of settling foundations. Conversations that once revolved around pool parties and holiday lights now turned to soil tests, retaining walls, and evacuation routes. And slowly, inevitably, they started coming to me. The first was Clara the nurse, whose basement wall had bowed. She knocked one rainy afternoon, holding a dripping umbrella and a plate of oatmeal cookies still warm from the oven. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "My husband thought you were extreme." "We both did, but after that night?" Her voice trailed off. She glanced toward the scar visible from my porch. "Could you look at our slope? Just tell us what you see." I walked over with her. We stood in her backyard while rain pattered on the leaves. I pointed out the tension cracks snaking from her foundation, the way water pooled in a shallow depression that hadn't existed before the grading. "It's moving," I said gently, "but it's slow. We can stabilize it better: drainage, lightweight fill, some deep-rooted natives to bind the soil." She nodded, eyes glistening. "Thank you, Jim." Word spread. Todd, the man with the 3-car garage, who'd once signed the petition against my flags, showed up next with a case of good beer and a sheepish grin. "Need help reinforcing that erosion gully behind my place?" he asked. We spent a Saturday hauling gravel and planting willows, working side by side in silence that felt more like reconciliation than conversation. Even the kids changed. The boy I'd pulled from the mud, Ethan, came by one evening with his mother clutching a hand-drawn card. A stick figure soldier planting a giant red flag on a hill with the words, "Thank you for saving me," in careful block letters. I knelt to his level. "You were brave out there, Ethan." He hugged me suddenly, fierce and quick, then ran back to his mom. The biggest surprise came on a gray November morning. My doorbell rang. I opened it to find Linda Talcott standing on the porch alone. No blazer, no clipboard, just a worn raincoat and dark circles under her eyes. She looked thinner, as if the weight she'd lost wasn't just from skipped meals. "I didn't come to argue," she said quietly. I stepped aside. "Coffee." She nodded. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd spread out maps and reports for years. She wrapped her hands around the mug, as if warming them from more than just the chill. "I've lost everything," she said finally. "The house is in foreclosure. Lawsuits drained the savings. My name. Well, you've seen the news." I waited. "I keep replaying it," she continued, voice barely above a whisper. "Every decision. Every meeting where we voted to remove your markers. I told myself it was for the greater good, for property values, for community spirit. But really..." She looked up, eyes red-rimmed. "I couldn't stand being wrong. Not in front of everyone." She fell silent for a long moment. I should have listened. The words hung between us. No drama, no tears, just the simple truth spoken at last. I nodded. A lot of people should have. She set the mug down carefully. "Some of us are leaving, selling what we can, starting over somewhere flat." A faint, bitter smile. "Kansas, maybe." I didn't offer comfort. There wasn't any to give. She stood to go. At the door, she paused. "For what it's worth, I'm glad no one died." "Me too," I said. "But some things did. Trust, homes, a sense of safety." She met my eyes one last time, then walked down the steps into the drizzle. I watched, until she disappeared around the corner. The new neighborhood council formed quietly, no elections, just volunteers stepping forward. They asked me to chair it. I declined the title, but agreed to advise. We met in living rooms and garages, mapping drainage improvements, debating native plantings versus turf, drafting simple guidelines based on science instead of aesthetics. One evening, Craig Walters, the accountant, who'd handed me the envelope of financial irregularities, suggested something radical: a permanent geological buffer zone where the park had been. No rebuilding, no structures, just reinforced drainage, deep-rooted grasses, and a walking trail along the safe contour. We voted unanimously. The city helped fund it. FEMA's final report cited our proposal as a model for post-disaster recovery. Work crews installed hidden perforated pipes to redirect subsurface flow, terraced the scar with gentle berms, and seeded it with wildflowers and willows. By spring, green shoots covered the raw earth. Butterflies returned. Deer grazed at dusk. And in the center, where the clubhouse foundation had once stood, we placed a simple granite marker, in memory of what was lost, because warnings matter. I didn't speak at the small dedication gathering. I just stood back and watched families lay flowers at its base, some for ruined homes, some for shattered illusions, some simply in gratitude that the worst had been survived. Ethan's mother placed a small red flag beside it, the kind I'd once hung along the boundary. It fluttered gently in the breeze. No one moved to take it down. Spring arrived gently that year, as if the land itself was tiptoeing back to trust. The scar where the park and clubhouse had stood, filled with wild-color lupine and poppies pushing through the reinforced soil willows, arching silver-green over the rerouted drainage swales. Butterflies drifted across the buffer zone like small apologies, carried on the wind. Children played along the new safe trail, their laughter rising clear and unafraid. The city launched its Geological Risk Integration for Neighborhood Development Program, GRID, they called it, with typical bureaucratic flair. Any proposed change in the subdivision now required an independent geotechnical review before a single shovel turned. They invited me to serve on the advisory panel. After some thought, I accepted, not for recognition, but because I'd earned a seat at that table the hard way. My first meeting was in a fluorescent-lit conference room downtown. Developers presented plans for a neighboring ridge. Engineers flipped through soil borings and shear strength charts. When a young landscape architect suggested minor grading for aesthetic enhancement, I slid the East Ridge case file across the table, photos of the collapse, the FEMA report, the granite marker. The room went quiet. The grading was denied. Afterward, the city asked if I'd help design community workshops. I agreed. We started small Saturday mornings in the elementary school multi-purpose room, coffee brewing in the corner, topographic maps spread across folding tables. I stood before groups of new buyers, longtime residents, even a few former HOA loyalists, who now sat in the back row with arms crossed but eyes attentive. I taught them how to read contour lines, how to spot tension cracks after rain, how water seeks the path of least resistance and takes the ground with it. I showed them cross-sections of our ridge, the clay layer glowing red in the diagram, like a warning vein. At the end of each session, I handed every participant a small red flag, the same inexpensive plastic ones I'd once hung along the boundary. They didn't laugh or roll their eyes. They tucked them carefully into pockets and purses, some pinning them to backpacks, or clipping them to garden gates as quiet reminders. The neighborhood council matured into something organic and sturdy. No officers, no dues, just shared labor and shared memory. When summer storms threatened, texts flew: need hands at the lower swale, bring shovels. 20 people showed up without being asked. We cleared debris from grates, redirected runoff, checked the monitoring wells the city had installed. One August evening, after a quick thunderstorm had passed, I walked the Rourke Line Trail, the name the council had quietly voted on while I was away at a grid meeting. The plaque was simple black letters on weathered cedar, no ceremony. I ran my fingers over the carved words and felt something loosen in my chest. Ethan found me there. He'd grown taller, hair sun-bleached, carrying a battered soccer ball. "Mr. Jim," he asked, kicking the ball lightly against his ankle. "Mom says the ground's safe now because of you." I crouched to his level. "The ground was always honest, Ethan. We're just better at listening." He nodded solemnly, then grinned. "Want to play?" We kicked the ball back and forth along the trail until dusk, his laughter echoing off the heeled slope. Later that fall, the state updated its HOA training curriculum. Every new board member now had to complete a module titled Geologic Hazard Awareness and Resident Notification Protocols, the centerpiece case study, East Ridge Estates. My warnings, the removed markers, the collapse laid out in stark timeline form. Linda's name wasn't mentioned, but the lesson was unmistakable. I received a copy in the mail, anonymous sender. I read it once, then filed it with the rest. The ridge kept healing. The condemned house nearest the scar was finally demolished. Bulldozers pushed the remnants into the basin. Then crews spread wildflower seed thick across the bare earth. By the following summer, the slope bloomed in waves of gold and violet. Families picnicked on the upper meadow, careful to stay above the steel boundary marker the city had installed, 3 feet of cold iron etched with the words, Historical Subsidence Zone, no construction beyond this point, maintained in perpetuity. One warm afternoon, I watched a group of teenagers pause there. One read the inscription aloud. They didn't joke or dare each other to cross. They simply stepped back, respecting the line the way sailors respect a reef. That evening, Brian joined me on the porch with a 6-pack. We sat in companionable silence, watching fireflies blink above the wildflowers. You know, they're calling it the Rourke effect in planning circles, he said eventually. When one persistent resident forces systemic change, I snorted. Sounds like a disease. Could be worse, he replied. Could be forgotten. We clinked bottles. Below us, porch lights winked on one by one. No one hurried inside anymore when clouds gathered. They checked the forecast, texted the group chat, walked the trails with new awareness. The ridge had become teacher rather than threat. And for the first time in 20 years, I slept without listening for the ground to shift. The warnings had been heard. The line held. And the land, scarred but steady, kept its ancient promise to carry us if we carried its lessons in return. Years have passed since that night the ridge gave way, yet some mornings I still wake, expecting to hear the low groan of shifting earth. Instead, I hear birdsong filtering through the open window and the distant hum of life rebuilding itself one careful, deliberate day at a time. I still live in the same cabin, the one I framed and roofed with my own hands just above the safe contour. The ancient oak out front has grown thicker, its branches reaching farther over the roof like a protective arm. My porch faces the healed scar, now a sweeping meadow of native grasses and wildflowers that glow golden in late summer light. The steel boundary marker stands sentinel at the trailhead, its inscription weathered but legible, a quiet testament no wind or rain has managed to erase. The Rourke Line Trail has become something of a local legend. On weekends, families hike it with dogs and picnic baskets. School groups come for field trips. Kids spreading out topographic maps on the grass, while teachers explain slope stability and the physics of failure. They always pause at the granite stone in the meadow's center. Some leave small bouquets. Others just stand in silence, absorbing the weight of what almost was. I join the walks when invited, answering questions in the plain language I've honed over countless workshops. Young couples thinking of buying in the area ask about drainage and root systems. Parents want to know how to teach their children respect for the land rather than fear of it. I tell them the same thing every time: listen to the ground. It speaks long before it shouts. The neighborhood itself has changed in ways no HOA newsletter could ever have mandated. Houses are painted whatever colors their owners love. Gardens spill over fences with tomatoes and sunflowers instead of uniform boxwoods. When storms roll in, the group chat lights up not with complaints, but with offers of help. We've installed rain gauges and simple inclinometers along the ridge. Data gets shared, freely discussed over coffee. Vigilance has become community, not isolation. Brian retired from the city last year. We still meet on the porch now and then, trading stories from deployments and disasters, watching the sun sink behind the trees. He teases me about the Rourke effect being taught in urban planning courses across the state. I shrug it off, but I've seen the syllabi. They use our story, the warnings ignored the collapse, the slow rebuilding, as a cautionary tale and a blueprint for resilience. I never sought credit. I only wanted the next person who saw danger coming to be believed before the ground had to prove the point. Linda's name surfaces rarely now. I heard she moved to the Midwest, took a quiet administrative job somewhere flat and predictable. No one here speaks ill of her anymore. The anger burned out long ago, replaced by a kind of weary understanding. We all carry versions of her in us, the temptation to choose comfort over truth, aesthetics over reality. The ridge taught us the cost. Some evenings, I walk the trail alone at dusk. The air cools, carrying the scent of sage and damp earth. Fireflies rise from the meadow like slow sparks. I pause at the steel marker, lay a hand on its cool surface, and feel the faint vibration of life beneath roots, knitting the soil water, moving safely through the hidden pipes, the slow heartbeat of a hillside that has chosen for now to hold. I think about my uncle's house, vanishing in 1961, about the screams over static in far-off mountains, about the boy I pulled from the mud, and the mothers who still send me Christmas cards. I think about red flags that once fluttered in warning and now wave gently in memory. The flags are gone, but the line remains. Etched in steel, seated in wildflowers, carved into the cautious wisdom of a community that finally learned to listen. And on quiet nights, when the wind moves softly through the oak and the meadow glows under starlight, I understand that vindication was never the point. The point was survival. Not just of homes or hillside, but of something deeper, the willingness to stand alone with the truth until the truth stands with you. The ground beneath my boots is steady now. And for the first time in decades, I trust it completely, because we have finally learned to trust each other and the ancient patient voice of the earth that carries us all.